Thank you very much. I didn't understand a word, but I'm sure it was very interesting. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope you are not too hungry. We're a bit late, but I will try and move quickly with my presentation so you can go and get your lunch. So thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here, and especially good to leave London in the autumn and be here in the lovely Chilean spring. Particular thanks to the Inter-American Development Bank for making my visit possible, and to Professor Espinosa for the invitation. Thank you. What I plan to do is to speak for about 35 minutes about supermax prisons and why I think that they are a bad idea. I think this is a subject that is very relevant here in Chile now, and in a number of other countries who are trying to figure out what to do with their prison populations, and in particular with people who are deemed to be high risk. And this should leave us some time for questions and answers. I will try and speak slowly for the benefit of the translator, but if I'm speaking too quickly, which I sometimes do when I get excited, tell me and I will slow down. Okay. So first of all, a note on terminology. I will refer to supermax interchangeably with restrictive housing, isolation prisons, or high security units. I will also use the term prisoner because there is no good alternative, but I note that there are issues with this terminology, so forgive me. Okay, so what are supermax prisons? These are large, high-tech, high-security prison facilities holding anywhere between 400 and 1,200 people in conditions of strict and perpetual solitary confinement for months, years, and sometimes even decades. Supermax prisons could be described as being at the far end of different forms of solitary confinement. The individual is isolated from their peers, from prison staff, and from the wider prison society, and of course from outside society. I think that we should just stop for a minute and talk about solitary confinement, which is at the heart of supermax prisons. So what you see on this slide is a definition from the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, now known as the Mandela Rules. And as you can see, the key element, there are two key elements in this definition. One is 22 hours or more a day without meaningful human contact. And the second is duration. So prolonged solitary confinement, which is anything exceeding 15 days, is prohibited under the Mandela Rules as a form of torture or ill treatment. This is important to remember because, as I said, in the context of supermax prisons, 15 days is nothing. We're talking about months and years and decades. Okay. So, of course, solitary confinement under different names is used in prison jurisdictions across the world. I don't know if this would play. Do we have speakers with a PPT? I'll see if this plays. Anyway, I will save you. There is a little video there of me in a solitary confinement cell where the door shuts and then you are suddenly alone in this empty cell. Okay, so just quickly, the pictures at the bottom here are, that is a cell, a solitary confinement cell in Norway, the one at the left. And then there are restraint beds, which are commonly used in many prisons. I don't know if they're used in Chile as well. So often, as well as the solitary confinement, there are other forms of restraint, if it's shackles, legs and hands, or indeed restraint beds. Just to say, these pictures are from New Zealand, Norway, and this one I think is from Denmark. So also nice countries also use these, I think, torturous instruments. Okay, so those in supermax are unquestionably held in prolonged solitary confinement. They will be strictly separated from everyone else. They will spend between 23 and 24 hours a day locked up in a small cell without meaningful human contact. I'm sorry, this is a bit dark. I don't know if you can read it, but what it says there, strictly no conversation with any prisoner without reporting to unit staff first. So this issue of meaningful human contact, it's not coincidental, it's part of the rationale of these prisons. This sign is from a prison in New Zealand. And indeed, when you visit Supermax prisons, certainly in the United States, you can see there is no communication. The prison guards bring everything to the prisoner inside the cell, so they bring the food, medication, post if they have any, without any communication whatsoever. It's quite striking when you witness this. Now, Supermax prisons are designed to facilitate and maximize isolation, surveillance, and control. They employ specialized architectural and high-tech operational innovations to enhance security and management. On this slide, you can see what I described as layers of isolation that exist in a specific Supermax at Pelican Bay in California. Now, as you can see, the picture on the top left, that is the prison site, Pelican Bay. And you can see the site is completely barren. Lots of beautiful, the redwoods of California, it's a beautiful area, but there is no beauty on the prison site. It's all gravel, gray, empty. Then you go to the next, you come into the prison. I won't take you through all the layers because there are many of them. So each of the layers on this graphic illustrates a separation between the prisoner and the world. You pass all these layers, there is site security, then there is the unit security, and then you go inside, there are endless corridors, doors, locks, gates, and then you come to the housing unit, which is the second picture that you see there. And as you can see, all the cells face a wall, so they can't see anything, no tree, no nothing. And then there is the yard. It's called the yard, but actually it's just a bit of concrete with nothing there. All the prisoner can do is just walk around and around and around. And that is what the cell looks like inside. That is the final and the innermost layer of isolation. Just to illustrate again, this is an illustration of El Chapo's cell in the ADEX, which is the federal supermax in Colorado. I think it speaks for itself. You can see how the cell is designed. Just to say, in this cell, the shower is inside the cell. In many units, there is no shower in the cell. The prisoner has to be taken out to a special shower cell where the guards control the temperature. You can only shower for usually up to 10 minutes. Everything is controlled. Something else to mention is that Supermax cells are often without any window, no window, and if there is a window, it's high above, so the prisoner cannot actually look out, but it does bring in a little bit of light, not much. So prisoners will only leave their cell alone for 1 hour solitary exercise in the yard that I showed you, or in a cage. 10 to 15 minutes in a shower cell, maybe 3 times a week, and a telephone call when it's allowed, once a week, usually for 10 minutes. These two basic activities can and are very, very frequently canceled because there are staff shortages or other operational reasons. Very occasionally, those in a Supermax will have an infrequent, no-contact family visit. This will take place in a booth like the one in this photograph. So the communication is via a telephone, and there is no contact between the prisoner and their visitors. Usually, in this case, this is a mesh. Usually, it's a glass. So really, there is no, you can't even touch their small finger, nothing. One person I interviewed in a supermax many years ago told me that he hasn't had any physical contact with anyone for over a decade. He specifically mentioned his mother, who died later, and he hasn't been able to hug her or anything. So as I mentioned, I had the misfortune, maybe good fortune, I don't know, because supermax are very hard to get into, of visiting two such facilities in the US in their early days, so in the late 1990s. The special housing unit, which I refer to in Pelican Bay, California, and the special management unit in Arizona. These are really eerie places. There is no life there. There is no noise. The only noise you can hear is the occasional harsh sound of a metal gate shutting, or guards shouting escort when they're escorting a prisoner, maybe to the prison infirmary or elsewhere. Usually every escort is 4 to 6 prison guards. It's really hard to explain in words the atmosphere of danger waiting behind every door and every corner. And these are places where you have thousands of human beings held in these tiny, tiny windowless cells, completely separated from other human beings. These are very, very harsh places. So what is the purpose of these prisons? This design of isolation reflects the official aims, which I listed on this slide, and the circumstances in which supermaxes were introduced. So in the United States, which remains, I think, the world leader in isolation prisons and the pioneer of the supermax, against a background of escalating prison violence throughout the 1980s, the idea was that removing from the main prison population gang leaders, chronic troublemakers, and the most violent individuals in the prison system, the other prisons would be able to operate safely and deliver programs and assist reintegration and rehabilitation. At least this is how supermaxes were marketed to the taxpayers. But as is often the case in the world of prison policy and practice, things did not quite work out as promised. Rather than housing a small number of highly challenging individuals, these massive isolation prisons were built at great expense, designed to hold several hundred people in conditions of extreme isolation. And rather than there just being one prison, they were built across the United States. So there is a federal supermax, and every state in the US operates at least one supermax prison. And the thing is that these massive construction projects were happening without any proper discussion of how effective they actually were and whether they were really needed. So what I'd like to do now is just to talk a little bit about how supermaxes measure up against their official aims and objectives. So first purpose, containment. I can't argue with the fact that supermax prisons do maybe successfully contain those held in them. It's impossible to escape from a supermax, and it's very difficult for anyone in a supermax to attack anyone else because they have no contact with anyone else. What is more questionable, though, is whether those individuals are really all, or by and large, high risk and very violent. I think that powerful local economic and political forces drove this expansion of building rather than a real need. And once prisons are built, they have to be filled, especially in jurisdictions that are overcrowded. So in the end, instead of holding just a small number of individuals who maybe genuinely needed closer supervision and control, these massive warehouses in practice now hold a lot of people with mental illness, minor gang members, and petty troublemakers, people who are just difficult to manage, maybe not very pleasant, maybe they speak unkindly, but they're not really dangerous to that degree. Okay, taking the next aim, protection. So, as I say, maybe supermaxes do make it physically impossible to attack another person because there is no contact. But acts of resistance, sometimes violent, happen in supermaxes too. directed at staff usually, for example, throwing urine at them, verbal abuse, or refusing orders, or violence directed at oneself. Self-harm is very, very common in supermaxes, and suicide. There are also acts of organized resistance, which I will discuss later. But for the sake of this conversation, I think we can say that supermaxes, by and large, reduced the immediate possibility of violence towards others. However, the impact of violence in the general population prisons is far less clear. A study by Chad Briggs and colleagues of the rates of violence in prison systems in 3 states, Arizona, Illinois, and Minnesota, before and after the introduction of supermax prisons, found no difference in prisoner-on-prisoner violence rates, and in Arizona, there was actually an increase in the number of staff injuries. Another study found a 9.7%, so almost 10% increase in violent misconduct among people who were previously placed in solitary confinement in a supermax. Not only that, but data suggests that reducing the use of restrictive housing leads to a reduction in prison violence. So Judith Thresnik and colleagues from the Lehman Center at Yale University found a 40 to 50% reduction in prison violence as the number of people held in restrictive housing in Colorado, this study went down from 7% in 2001 to 1.2% in 2015. So 40 to 50% reduction of prison violence when there was less restrictive housing. And there is also some evidence of an increase in post-confinement violence amongst people who have spent time in restrictive housing. A 2009 study from Florida State University found that 24.2%, let's call it 24% of people who were previously incarcerated in a supermax were reconvicted of violent crime. This is a rate which is 18% higher than those who have not been previously in a supermax. Lastly, another form of violence which is often overlooked in statistics on prison violence is that it is directed towards oneself. The rate of suicides and other forms of self-harm in isolation units is significantly higher than in other parts of the prison, and the risk of harm continues beyond the person's incarceration. One study found that people who were previously held in restrictive housing in solitary confinement were 78% more likely to die by suicide in the first year post-release from prison than those who have not spent time in solitary confinement. So, does it reduce prison violence? That doesn't seem to be the case. Thirdly, isolation, and specifically cutting off communications regarding criminal activity, which was one of the main rationales for introducing supermax prisons. So as I've demonstrated, supermax prisons seek to place prisoners behind multiple layers of isolation, but there are limits to what can be achieved within the limits of permissible treatment. People deprived of their liberty have always found alternative methods of communication, even in isolation. Firstly, communication can occur through shouting, through vents, through cell doors, or other shared structures. This inability to completely cut off communications was well demonstrated by a hunger strike organized by people in California supermax in protest of their conditions of solitary confinement. Not only did people manage to coordinate and organize a hunger strike in which 6,000 people across California's prisons took place, across gang and across racial divides, which is interesting. So in a way, Supermax assisted in bringing rival gangs together to organize this strike. The hunger strike started in July 2013, and on that specific day, more than 29,000 people across California's prisons refused food completely, and all of that to protest conditions of solitary confinement. The strike ended in September, so July to September, it's quite a long time. As I mentioned, one of the key formal objectives of supermax prisons was to isolate the heads of organized crime groups and prison gangs, so that the rest of the prison system can function better. Now, given the near impossibility of cutting off all communications, gang bosses may be able to continue to run their business from prison, even from isolation units. Furthermore, experience from the United States suggests that when gang leaders were taken off, were taken off the general population, turf wars over future leadership and gang activity in the rest of the prison started, and that, of course, led to a lot of prison violence. And now, where there was once one leader, now there were several people competing to take their place. So I don't think we can say that it has been a success in limiting gang activity. The fourth objective of Supermax, protecting society, it's a big aim. I would suggest that far from protecting society, Supermax prisons over time do the exact reverse. People deprived of their liberty in a Supermax are deprived not only of human company, but also from participation in educational, vocational, and recreational activities, and from access to therapeutic and rehabilitative treatment, dramatically affecting their health and well-being. So the decision to place someone in solitary confinement in a Supermax affects not only their immediate conditions of confinement, quality of daily life and health, it can also negatively impact the length of their prison sentence because they cannot demonstrate good behavior or progress in their rehabilitative journey, which could in turn and usually does lead to a reduced sentence, and therefore their chances of parole. And when individuals are eventually released, the time that they have spent without human company can also affect and does affect their successful reintegration back into society. So as I said, there are a lot of suicides of people after release from Supermax, and those who manage to stay alive report having very lonely lives, finding it very difficult to maintain intimate relationships. They're finding big groups, society difficult to deal with, and they lead a very, very lonely life. So I would suggest that these prisons are incompatible with the goals of rehabilitation and social reintegration, which, as we know, are officially among the key purposes of imprisonment. Now, as virtually all Supermax prisoners will over time be released from prison, I think we must be concerned about the prospect of people who are deprived of human contact and purposeful activities returning to society without any preparation. Okay, so Supermax prisons fail, I argue, against their own objectives. And crucially, these objectives fail to take into account what spending time in a Supermax does to the mental and physical health of prisoners. They come at a very high mental health cost, as you can see on this slide. Solitary confinement, this combination of solitary confinement, reduced sensory stimulation, because I didn't mention, I'm sorry, but there are great restrictions on what people can keep in their cell. They can keep a few books, a number of photographs, personal photographs, legal materials if they are engaged in a ongoing legal case, but very little other than that. Sometimes they have a television, not always. Reduced sensory stimulation and the tight control, the constant surveillance are known to cause serious health effects. And going back to the discussion of violence, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that most reactions, as you can see here, lead to either anger or depression. So anger obviously can manifest as violence, and the latter, depression, can manifest as self-harm. Both of these are behaviors which Supermax purports to address. Now, as well as being extremely damaging to health and well-being, Supermax are extremely expensive. They're extremely expensive to build, and they're extremely expensive to run. So any saving made over time because there are no activities and programs is balanced by the extremely high cost of building the prisons and their fortified high-tech features and the high cost of housing people in them. So for example, to use Pelican Bay as an example, the cost some years ago, actually, I'm sure that it's much more now, was estimated of the cost of housing one person in Pelican Bay was estimated at almost $71,000. That is compared to a cost of $58,000 of holding someone in the general population. Other states report an even bigger gap, so it costs almost twice as much to hold someone in a supermax. After many years of these prisons spreading all over the United States, some policymakers have understood this case against supermax and pressed for reform. So between 2009 and 2022, 886 bills were introduced in 45 states to restrict or to completely end the use of prolonged solitary confinement as in a supermax. 40 states passed at least one of these bills, and these include bills to restrict the use of solitary confinement, to limit its duration, or to completely exclude certain categories of people who are particularly vulnerable to the ill effects of solitary confinement from supermax: young people, people with mental illness, and in some cases, women. But in the meantime, as these things happen, the supermax model has spread across the world, although on a much smaller scale than in the United States. So in Australia, there is a small unit. In Brazil, there is a unit. And other countries who have until now resisted large-scale isolation prisons are now considering their introduction. The impetus for this often comes from prison staff and the representative bodies, so guard unions, against the background of serious prison violence, which is framed in terms of wider societal concern. So these are press examples from the United Kingdom and from France, which are tied. So in England, this is very current, this is happening now. There are calls to introduce a supermax tied with societal concerns about terrorism and immigration. The image under the caption at the top left is an immigrant who killed 3 little girls in a notorious knife attack last year. And then when he was imprisoned, he brutally attacked prison officers. He caused one very serious injury. In France, the ambush of a prison van transporting the boss of a notorious organized crime group and the killing of 2 prison officers in the process of this ambush spurred on plans to build a new supermax-style prison in French Guiana's border with Suriname, with space for 500 people, including 60 maximum security prisons. But you can see the language is all framed around terrorism and drug lords. Now, I know that Chile has suffered its own issues and violence against prison staff, not least in an incident in June last year involving Special High Security Penitentiary, the REPAS, in Santiago, where 3 prisoners and 12 staff members were injured, and which involved a Venezuelan-born transnational organized crime group. I note that media coverage of this event referred to a new type of criminal against whom traditional measures of control are ineffective. This is a language that I'm very familiar with from the United States and the early days of supermax prisons. Perhaps this is not surprising. In Ipsos Mori, just this last August, survey of what worries the world, 64% of people in Chile ranked crime and violence as one of the top 3 worries. That's the second highest percentage out of the 30 countries in the sample. Number 1, incidentally, was Peru. So supermax prisons offer the promise of a solution to the problems that plague our societies, whatever the prevailing moral panic is at the time. If it's terrorism or drugs or gangs or organized crime, supermaxes are presented as a silver bullet. Build a supermax and all the problems will be solved. Now, of course, where fears about crime are the highest, the pressures on politicians to offer the public something eye-catching to tackle it, and supermax prisons are eye-catching, are most likely to occur. But I think we must resist this rising tide. Of course, there are very challenging and violent individuals in prison systems, and successfully managing them is something that prison administrations across the world are grappling with. Some form of isolation or solitary confinement is often proposed as the way forward. But I believe that we can and we should do better than simply holding human beings in conditions that we know are extremely harmful to their health and well-being. It may well be the case that some individuals need to be housed in smaller units, but rather than these massive isolation units, we need to encourage engagement. Rather than remote surveillance and security, they should operate on principles of dynamic security, with emphasis on an ongoing, substantive assessment of the need to keep the person in conditions of high security, and also reassessment all the time of the specific security protocols which need to be followed with them. For example, during family visits, or the need to shackle them every time they leave the cell. For this to happen, prison staff need to be trained in mental health, conflict resolution, trauma-informed practice, and techniques of controlling prisoners without the use of force. Decision-making should be done by a multidisciplinary team, and the prisoners should be part of the process involving them as much as possible. Now, that, of course, takes good resourcing and commitment from staff, but I've seen that happening in practice, and it makes a fundamental difference. Importantly, if the aim is to contain prisoners labeled as dangerous or disruptive, they must be provided with programs designed to get to the bottom of, address, and reduce their disruptiveness, for example, violence reduction programs. And they must be able to demonstrate that they are no longer a danger to others. If a person is locked away from other human beings in a small cell with nothing to do, where his frustration builds up and up and up, how does that improve matters? How can they demonstrate that they are safe to be with others? Supermax prisons harm prospects of rehabilitation and reintegration. As a colleague and I noted, I'm quoting myself here, which, thus, as a decision to place a prisoner in solitary confinement entails that they will not be able to access education or work programs, this decision, in effect, denies the prisoner any realistic opportunity of parole and the utility of a gradual release from prison. In other words, placing a prisoner in solitary confinement not only affects the quality, but also the quantity of a criminal sentence. Not only is access to programs critical, but also the quality of relationships between prisoner and staff. This quote is from the Home Office, which is the British, I don't know what the Chilean equivalent would be, but they're in charge of prisons and prison policy. And this was the conclusion of a committee that was set up following a serious prison disturbance in England. And as you can see, they concluded that the key, most important thing for maintaining prison order is not isolation, but relationships. And good communication skills are a key factor in this. I did a study with some colleagues of prisons in England and Wales, and we reached the same conclusion. We concluded that prisons needed to invest more, not less, in the small number of individuals that may need to be observed more closely. And this dichotomy of us versus them between prisoners and staff, as if they're in two opposing sides, that if the welfare of one requires compromising the welfare of the other, as if isolating prisoners would make staff more safe, this needs to stop. I think that more generally, there needs to be some balance between human rights and humane treatment and security needs. Supermax prisons lose this balance. The balance, it goes completely on security, and humane treatment goes out of the window. And experience has shown that if the imbalance is too wide, too unfair, goes too far, that was to emphasize, the regime loses legitimacy, and then things can, and they do, deteriorate, and order becomes more difficult to achieve. As the California hunger strike, which I referred to earlier, has shown, people deprived of their liberty are able to organize acts of resistance, even from isolation cells, and even beyond the confines of their prison and onto the general population. I'm sorry, I'm very behind with my slides. This is the slide that I was referring to about relationships. And these are some examples of prison disorder. So, Supermax prisons are expensive, they're ineffective, and they drive people mad. They raise profound ethical issues, and the conditions of them may and do amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, and in some cases, torture. There is little evidence that they meet their official aims and quite a lot of evidence that they fail to meet them. Supermax prisons and their official promise of controlling risky individuals may sound like a tempting option offered to the public as a solution to raising levels of crime and fear of crime. But warehousing thousands of people in strict isolation in big high-tech prisons does nothing to tackle the underlying causes of crime. I love this image. This is a picture of one of 6 gold-plated Harley-Davidson motorcycles belonging to the Comanchores gang, originating in Australia, who then moved to operate in New Zealand and were seized by the New Zealand police during an operation and destroyed. The bikes were valued at about 96,000 New Zealand dollars, were crushed in an attempt to send a message about profiting for crime and discouraging young people, especially young men living in deprived neighborhoods, from joining gangs. A very eye-catching move, but a futile one. As one former gang leader in New Zealand said to me in an interview after he was released from prison, he said, "Give me some alternative, give me something to do, make it worth my while. Otherwise, people just go back to what they know." I think that tackling big societal issues effectively, poverty, inequality, racism, crime, requires more than eye-catching gestures, whether it's catching gold-plated motorbikes or introducing a supermax. I think that this trend of large-scale isolation prisons needs to be resisted. Good oversight mechanisms, such as those you have here in Chile, highlighting human rights concerns, are necessary for this. I also think that it's essential for us researchers and academics to properly engage with policymakers and put forward evidence-based assessments and propose alternatives, sharing our knowledge and experience of the history and experiences of other jurisdictions. This is not always easy or simple. I think we tend to be quite attached to our particular schools of thought, and there are those of us who feel that engaging with these issues legitimizes prison somehow, or that there is no point and our voices are not heard. In my experience, this is not true. My recent study of isolation units in the Netherlands, commissioned by the Dutch Prison Service, prompted the introduction of a new policy to minimize and humanize use of isolation and the adoption of the Mandela rules and their 14-day limit. So change can be achieved, and I would encourage all of you to explore how in your work you can inform public policy and some of the key issues facing our societies. Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions. I can't see you, so you're going to have to make yourselves known. Any questions? No questions. Do you have a question? No? No questions? Okay. Two questions. Excellent. Thank you. Very good question. How does Supermax affect teenagers? We have a lot of medical literature on how isolation affects the teenage brain. which, as you would know, continues to develop until the age of 25. So basically putting someone in a supermax just freezes them uh, at the age they were when they entered isolation. And the way the brain works is if it doesn't develop, it just stays as it is. So the effects are very, very serious. Is there any particular evidence about the effects of Supermax on teenagers in America? I am unaware of that. What I can tell you is that many jurisdictions now are ensuring that their youngsters are released from isolation. Having said that, in Australia, for example, it's very common to have young people, especially young men and especially Aboriginal young men in prolonged solitary confinement. Yeah. How does it affect families? It breaks down relationships, basically, because there is no contact. It's very, very difficult to maintain a family life over years and decades of isolation. It makes intimate relationships impossible during that period. And I think you need to have a really, really a very strong and specific relationship to be able to maintain that over time. We know that families are penalized alongside the prisoner in many ways, both in terms of prejudices, but also in terms, they have to undergo a lot of humiliating procedures in order to visit the person in isolation. So I'd say the effects are very negative. Is there any specific literature on the effects on families? Not that I'm aware of. Thank you very much. Thank you all.